The water was so hot it made her hands ache, but she kept scrubbing. That's what 3 years in this kitchen had taught her. Keep your head down, do your work, and don't make waves. The massive steel pots weren't going to clean themselves, and there were at least 20 more waiting for her. She had arrived in this country with nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of hope. Well, hope mixed with fear, the kind of fear that comes from leaving everything you know behind. Her apartment was tiny, barely big enough for a bed and a small table, but it was hers. This job at Riverside Restaurant paid the bills. Barely. But it was honest work, and after everything that had happened back home, honest work felt like a blessing. The kitchen was loud that evening. Friday nights always were. Chefs shouting orders, pans clanging, the ticket machine printing endlessly. She had learned to tune it out, to find a rhythm in the chaos. Scrub, rinse, stack. Scrub, rinse, stack. Her mind could wander while her hands worked, but tonight was different. Tonight there was something in the dining room that kept pulling her attention. Through the small window in the kitchen door, she could see it. A beautiful black grand piano polished until it gleamed under the soft lights. It sat in the corner of the dining room like a sleeping giant, waiting. She knew she shouldn't look. Shouldn't care, but every time she carried a tray of dirty dishes past that door, her eyes found it. Her fingers would twitch without her permission, remembering movements she hadn't made in years. "Hey, you daydreaming over there?" One of the line cooks laughed as he dumped another stack of plates beside her. "We've got a whole dining room out there to feed." "Sorry," she mumbled, plunging her hands back into the soapy water. The restaurant was hosting some kind of fancy event tonight. She'd heard the servers talking about it all week. Rich people coming to donate money to charity. The kind of people who wore jewelry that cost more than she made in a year. The kind of people who would never notice someone like her. Around 7 o'clock, her supervisor told her to take the trash out to the dumpster. She grabbed the heavy bag and pushed through the back door into the alley. The evening air was cool and felt wonderful after the heat of the kitchen. She took a moment, just breathing, looking up at the slice of sky visible between the buildings. When she came back inside, she had to walk through a different hallway, one that passed by the dining room entrance. And there it was again. The piano. She stopped just for a second. Just to look at it properly, it was a Steinway. She could tell from across the room, the kind of instrument she used to play on stages across Europe. Her chest tightened with a feeling she couldn't quite name. Loss, longing, both? Don't even think about it. The voice behind her was sharp and cold. She jumped, spinning around. It was the restaurant manager. He was a tall man who wore expensive suits and always had that look on his face. The look that said he was better than everyone around him. "I wasn't," she started, but he cut her off. "That piano costs more than you'll make in 5 years. Probably 10, knowing what we pay dishwashers." He smirked, clearly pleased with his own joke. "So keep your wet, soapy hands away from it." Her face burned. She nodded quickly and hurried back toward the kitchen, her eyes on the floor. Behind her, she could hear him laughing, talking to some of the waiters who had gathered nearby. "Can you believe that? The dishwasher thinks she can play piano." His voice carried, loud and mocking. "What's next? Maybe the janitor wants to perform surgery. Maybe the busboy wants to fly a plane." The laughter that followed felt like needles in her back. She pushed through the kitchen doors and went straight to her station. Her hands shook as she picked up another pot to scrub. Not from anger. Well, maybe a little anger, but mostly from the memories flooding back. She had played piano since she was 5 years old. Her mother had worked 3 jobs to pay for lessons. By the time she was 15, she was performing in competitions. At 20, she was playing in concert halls. Real ones with hundreds of seats and perfect acoustics. She had worn beautiful dresses and bowed to applause that sounded like thunder. Then she had made one mistake. One interview where she said what she really thought about the government in her country. One moment of honesty that cost her everything. They blacklisted her, revoked every license and permit. Suddenly, no concert hall would book her. No orchestra would hire her. She became invisible overnight, so she ran, came here, started over with nothing, and now she washed dishes and got mocked for even looking at a piano. "Forget about him," one of the other kitchen workers whispered to her. An older woman who had always been kind. "He treats everyone like dirt." It's not personal, but it felt personal. It felt like the universe was reminding her of everything she'd lost. The evening rushed on. More dishes, more pots, more pans. Her hands moved automatically while her mind stayed stuck on that piano. on the feel of ivory keys under her fingers, on the way music could fill a room and make time stop. Around 8 o'clock, she heard raised voices in the hallway. Something was wrong. The manager was talking fast on his phone, pacing back and forth. She caught pieces of the conversation through the kitchen door. "What do you mean your car broke down? You were supposed to be here an hour ago. I have a room full of donors waiting for live music." The hired pianist wasn't coming. She watched through the small window as the manager made call after call. Each time his face got redder. Each time his voice got more desperate. Every pianist in the city was already working. It was Friday night. Prime time. The restaurant owner appeared. An older man in an expensive suit. Even from the kitchen she could see he was upset. "We promised these people an elegant evening," he said, his voice tight. "Live piano music was part of the package. They paid good money for this event." "I know, sir. I'm trying everything I can think of. Try harder." The kitchen had gone quiet. Everyone was listening now. This kind of drama didn't happen often. She dried her hands on her apron. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was crazy. She should keep her mouth shut. She should stay invisible like she'd been for 3 years. But her feet carried her to the kitchen door. Her hand pushed it open. And before she could stop herself, before she could think about all the reasons this was a terrible idea, the words came out. "I can play." The hallway went silent. Every head turned toward her. The manager stared at her like she'd just spoken in a foreign language. Maybe she had. Maybe those 3 words were foreign in this place where she was just the dishwasher. "What did you say?" the manager asked slowly. She swallowed hard. Her mouth was dry. "I said I can play. The piano. I can play it." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the manager threw his head back and laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was the kind of laugh that makes you feel small and stupid. "You? You can play piano?" He looked around at the gathered staff, grinning. Did everyone hear that? "Our dishwasher here thinks she can perform for a room full of millionaires and donors." "I can," she said quietly. "I really can." "This is perfect," he said, still laughing. "You know what? Fine. Sure. If you can play piano well enough for this event, I'll quit. I'll walk out that door right now and never come back." The restaurant owner looked between them. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious," the manager said. "If this dishwasher can play at a professional level, I'll quit my job tonight. Everyone here is my witness." He turned back to her, his eyes cold. "But when you embarrass yourself out there, when you humiliate this restaurant in front of 100 wealthy guests, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that you brought this on yourself." She felt her hands trembling again. This could go so wrong. She hadn't played for an audience in 3 years. What if her fingers didn't remember? What if the fear was too much? But she thought about that laugh. About being treated like she was nothing. About hiding who she really was for so long that she'd almost forgotten herself. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll play." The walk from the kitchen to the dining room felt like miles. Her legs felt strange, like they belonged to someone else. Behind her, she could hear whispers. The other kitchen staff had gathered by the door to watch. Some looked worried for her. Others looked curious. A few looked like they were watching a car accident about to happen. She still wore her kitchen uniform, a white shirt with stains from 3 years of washing dishes, black pants that had seen better days, an apron with her name tag barely hanging on. Her hands smelled like dish soap no matter how many times she'd rinsed them. This wasn't how she'd imagined returning to a piano. The manager walked beside her, that smirk still plastered on his face. He was enjoying this. He thought he was about to watch her fail in front of everyone. Thought he'd get to laugh even harder when she couldn't do it. The dining room was full. Round tables covered in white cloths. Crystal glasses catching the light. Well-dressed people talking and laughing, unaware of the drama unfolding. She could smell expensive perfume and cologne mixing with the scent of the evening's meal. As they walked toward the piano, conversations started to die down. People noticed. Of course they noticed. A woman in kitchen clothes walking through their elegant event. She felt every eye turning toward her. Felt the questions in their stares. "Ladies and gentlemen," the manager announced in his smooth professional voice, the voice he used for important guests. "We've had a slight change in our evening's entertainment. Our scheduled pianist couldn't make it. But fortunately we have a replacement. One of our kitchen staff has volunteered to play for us tonight. A ripple of confused murmurs went through the crowd. She saw people exchanging glances. Some looked amused. Others looked skeptical. A few looked genuinely curious. The restaurant owner stood near the bar. His face was tight with worry. He'd agreed to let her try, but she could see he was having second thoughts. This could make his restaurant look foolish. Could upset his wealthy donors. She reached the piano and just stood there for a moment. The Steinway was even more beautiful up close. The black surface was so perfectly polished she could see her reflection in it. A tired woman with soap-roughened hands and fear in her eyes. Her fingers touched the fallboard. The wood was cool and smooth. She lifted it carefully, revealing the keys. Perfect ivory and ebony. 88 keys that could create any music ever written. The bench creaked slightly as she sat down. She adjusted her position, finding the right distance from the keys. Muscle memory. Her body remembered even if her mind was screaming in panic. The room was quiet now, waiting, judging. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking. These hands had scrubbed thousands of pots and pans, had cleaned up other people's messes for 3 years. But before that, these same hands had played for presidents and princes, had brought audiences to tears with nothing but music. Could they still do it? She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then another. She thought about her mother, who had believed in her when no one else did. About the first piano teacher who told her she had a gift. About the first time she'd performed on a real stage and felt the magic of connecting with an audience through music. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who wasn't afraid. Her fingers found the keys. The first note rang out clear and pure. Then the second. Then a cascade of sound that seemed to fill every corner of the room. She was playing Chopin, Nocturne in E-flat major. One of the most beautiful pieces ever written. One she'd performed 100 times before everything fell apart. And just like that, she wasn't in a restaurant anymore. She was back on stage where she belonged. The fear melted away. There was only the music. Her fingers danced across the keys like they'd been waiting for this moment. Soft passages that were barely whispers, then powerful sections that made the piano sing out. The dynamics flowed naturally the way they were supposed to. The way only someone who truly understood the music could make them flow. She'd forgotten how this felt. The way time disappeared when she played. The way the rest of the world faded until there was nothing but sound and emotion, and the vibration of strings under her fingertips. The piece built to its emotional center. The part that always made her heart ache. Her hands moved faster now, but never rushed. Each note was exactly where it needed to be. The melody sang above the rolling accompaniment, telling a story without words. She could feel the room holding its breath. As the last notes faded away, she kept her hands on the keys for a moment. Eyes still closed, living in that last echo of sound, then silence. Complete, total silence. She opened her eyes, suddenly terrified. Had she messed up? Had her hands forgotten after all? Had she just humiliated herself exactly like the manager predicted? Then the applause started. It began with one person, then two. Then suddenly the entire room was clapping. Not polite, obligatory applause. Real applause. The kind that comes from people who just experienced something genuine and unexpected and beautiful. People were standing up, getting to their feet. Some were wiping their eyes. Others were staring at her like they couldn't believe what they'd just heard. She turned on the bench, overwhelmed. A woman at the nearest table had tears running down her face. An older man was nodding slowly, a smile on his face. A young couple held hands, both looking stunned. "More," someone called out. "Please, play more." The request was picked up by others. "Yes, another piece. Please." She looked at the restaurant owner. He was standing completely still, his mouth slightly open. Then he smiled, actually smiled, and nodded at her to continue. Her heart soared. She turned back to the piano. This time she didn't hesitate. She launched into Debussy, Clair de Lune, Moonlight. The piece flowed like water, gentle and dreaming. Her hands knew every note, every subtle shift in tone and volume. The room had gone quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not skeptical or judging, attentive, appreciative. The kind of silence an audience gives when they don't want to miss a single note. She played for 20 minutes without stopping. Chopin to Debussy to Rachmaninoff, pieces that showcased different sides of her skill. delicate and powerful, simple and complex, each one a small world of emotion and story. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys after the final piece, the applause was thunderous. People weren't just clapping. They were cheering. She heard someone shout, "Brava!" Others were calling out compliments. She stood from the bench, her legs unsteady. She wasn't used to performing anymore. Wasn't used to being seen. For 3 years, she'd been invisible. Now she felt like she was standing in a spotlight so bright it might burn her up. The restaurant owner rushed forward. His face was completely transformed from the worried expression he'd worn earlier. "That was extraordinary," he said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Truly extraordinary. I had no idea. Where did you learn to play like that?" The room went quiet again. Everyone wanted to hear the answer. She took a breath. This was the part she'd been avoiding for 3 years. The part where she had to talk about who she used to be. "I was a concert pianist," she said. Her voice sounded small after the big sound of the piano. "Back in Europe. I performed in concert halls. I recorded albums. It was my whole life, was?" The owner asked gently. "What happened?" She could feel the manager standing somewhere behind her. Could imagine his face right now. The smirk would be gone, replaced by shock, maybe embarrassment. She hoped it was embarrassment. "I gave an interview to a newspaper," she continued. "They asked me what I thought about some things the government was doing. I answered honestly. I told the truth about corruption and injustice. I thought it was safe. I thought journalists protected their sources." The room was so quiet she could hear the kitchen noises through the closed door. They published my name and my comments. Within a week, I was blacklisted. They revoked my performance licenses. Concert halls were told not to book me. Orchestras were warned not to hire me. I went from performing for thousands of people to not being able to play a single public note. An older woman at a nearby table gasped. Others shook their heads in sympathy. So I left. I took what little money I had and came here. Started over. I took the first job I could find because I needed to eat and pay rent. I thought maybe I'd never play for an audience again. Thought that part of my life was over. She paused, looking around at all these strangers who had just heard her pour out her heart through music. Tonight I thought maybe I could have just a few minutes, just a little piece of who I used to be, and it felt like coming home. The applause started again, but this time it was different, softer, warmer, the kind of applause that says we see you and we understand and thank you for sharing your gift with us. The owner was looking at her with something like wonder in his eyes. "What's your name?" he asked. She told him. Her real name. Not just the name on her employee badge. Her full name, the one that used to appear on concert posters. "Well," he said, turning to address the room, "I think we've all witnessed something very special tonight. Let's give our talented pianist one more round of applause." The room erupted again, but she was looking past the owner now, looking at the manager. He stood near the bar, his face pale. The smirk was definitely gone. He looked like someone who had just realized he'd made a terrible mistake. Their eyes met across the room, and she knew everything was about to change. The applause was still ringing in her ears when the restaurant owner turned toward the bar, toward the manager who had laughed at her, who had mocked her in front of everyone, who had made that promise. "I believe," the owner said, his voice carrying across the quiet room, "that you made a statement earlier, something about quitting if she could play professionally." Every eye in the dining room turned to the manager. He stood frozen, his face going from pale to red. His hands clenched at his sides. That was just," he stammered. "I didn't actually think." "You didn't think what?" The owner's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. "You didn't think she could play? You didn't think your words mattered? You didn't think anyone would hold you accountable?" The manager looked around desperately, like he was searching for an escape route. But there was nowhere to go. The entire room was watching. Kitchen staff peered through the door. Servers stood in the corners. The wealthy donors who had paid good money for this charity event all had their attention fixed on this unfolding drama. "Sir, with all due respect, I was just making a joke." "I never meant a joke." The owner cut him off. "You humiliated a member of our staff. You mocked her in front of her co-workers. You made cruel assumptions based on nothing but her job title and where she came from. And now you want to call it a joke?" She stood by the piano watching this happen. Part of her felt vindicated. T of her felt uncomfortable being at the center of such a public confrontation. She just wanted to play piano. She hadn't meant to start this. But another part of her, the part that had been scrubbing dishes and staying invisible for 3 years, felt something else, something that had been dormant. For so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Pride, self-respect, the knowledge that she was worth more than how she'd been treated. Everyone in this room heard you make that promise, the owner continued. His voice wasn't angry. That made it more powerful somehow. He was simply stating facts. You said if she could play at a professional level, you would quit. Well, I think we can all agree that what we just witnessed was far beyond professional. That was world-class. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Several people nodded. The older man, who had been smiling during her performance, called out, "I've attended concerts at Carnegie Hall. What she just played was as good as anything I've heard there." The manager's face was now completely red. "I have a family," he said desperately. "I need this job. I can't just—" "You should have thought about that before you made promises you weren't prepared to keep," the owner said. "Before you treated another human being with such disrespect." The manager turned to her then. His eyes were pleading. "Look, I'm sorry. Okay, I apologize. I shouldn't have said those things. I was wrong. Can we just forget this whole thing happened?" She looked at him. Really looked at him. This man who had made her feel small every day. Who had mocked not just her, but probably dozens of other people who worked under him. Who thought being in charge gave him the right to be cruel. "I accept your apology," she said quietly. Every ear in the room strained to hear her. "But accepting an apology doesn't erase consequences. You didn't just hurt me tonight. You revealed who you are, how you treat people you think are beneath you." The silence in the room was absolute. The owner nodded slowly. "She's right. This isn't just about tonight. I've been hearing complaints about you for months. Staff members afraid to speak up. A hostile work environment. I've been too busy to address it properly, but this has brought everything into clear focus." He turned to address the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption to your evening. But I think it's important that actions have consequences, that we treat everyone with dignity regardless of their position, that we keep our word." Then he looked back at the manager. "You have a choice. You can resign as you promised. Write it up nicely, leave with some dignity. Or I can fire you right now for creating a hostile work environment and treating staff with disrespect. Either way, your employment here ends tonight." The manager's shoulders slumped. He looked around one more time, but no one came to his defense. The servers he'd laughed with earlier looked away. The bartender busied himself with glasses. Even his fellow managers standing near the kitchen said nothing. "I'll resign," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good. You can leave now. Security will box up your office belongings and send them to you." The manager walked toward the exit like a man in a dream, or a nightmare. The room watched in silence as he pushed through the doors and disappeared into the night. The moment he was gone, the atmosphere changed. It was like a heavy cloud had lifted. The owner turned back to her, and now his face was warm. Excited even. "Now then," he said, "we need to talk about your future here. But first, I think these generous people would appreciate a few more pieces. Would you be willing?" She looked at the piano, at the faces watching her with anticipation instead of judgment, at the opportunity opening up before her like a door she'd thought was locked forever. "I would love that," she said. The applause that followed felt different from before. It felt like acceptance, like belonging. She sat back down at the piano and played for another hour. She played pieces she hadn't touched in years, songs that had been locked away in her memory along with her old life. Each one came back to her fingers like an old friend. Between pieces, people came up to talk to her, to ask questions, to share their own stories. The older man who had mentioned Carnegie Hall turned out to be a retired music professor. "My dear, what you have is rare," he told her. "Not just technical skill, though you have that in abundance, but soul. You play with genuine emotion. That can't be taught." A younger woman with kind eyes introduced herself as the director of a local arts foundation. "We host concerts throughout the year. Small venues, intimate settings. I would love to have you perform. Here's my card. Please call me." A businessman in an expensive suit pressed a business card into her hand as well. "My wife and I sponsor young artists." "Well, any artists, really. People who deserve a chance. We'd like to help if you're interested." She collected the cards with trembling fingers, her apron pockets filled with possibilities. The restaurant owner stayed nearby, beaming like a proud parent. Between her performances, he quietly told her they needed to have a serious conversation. About her position, about her future, about properly compensating her for her talent. Around 10 o'clock, the event started winding down. Guests began leaving, but many stopped to thank her personally, to tell her how moved they were, how unexpected and wonderful the evening had turned out to be. One elderly lady with pearls and white hair took her hand. "I lost my daughter 5 years ago," she said softly. "She played piano too. You reminded me of her tonight. Thank you for that gift." She felt tears prick her eyes as she squeezed the woman's hand. When the last guest had left and the servers were clearing tables, she finally stood up from the piano bench. Her back was stiff from sitting so long. Her fingers were tired in the best possible way. The kind of tired that comes from doing what you're meant to do. The kitchen staff had gathered near the door. Her co-workers. The people who had seen her at her lowest, scrubbing pots with red raw hands. They started clapping as she walked toward them. It wasn't the polite applause of wealthy donors. It was loud and rowdy and full of genuine happiness for her. The line cooks whooped. The servers whistled. The other dishwasher, an older woman who had always been kind to her, had tears streaming down her face. "We knew you were special," the older woman said, pulling her into a hug. "We didn't know why, but we knew." The owner appeared with 2 chairs. "Sit," he said, gesturing to her and then pulling one up for himself. "Let's talk about your future." She sat, still in her stained kitchen uniform, feeling like she was in a dream. "First things first," he said. "You're no longer a dishwasher as of right now. That's not a demotion. It's a recognition of reality. You're a musician, a professional performer." Her heart hammered in her chest. "I'd like to hire you as our house pianist. You would perform here 3 or 4 evenings a week. Proper salary, of course. Significantly more than you're making now. We could even build a small stage for the piano, make it a featured part of the dining experience." He pulled out his phone and started showing her numbers. The salary he was suggesting was more than 3 times what she currently made. Enough to move out of her tiny apartment. Enough to breathe. "I can't accept this based on one night," she said, even though every part of her wanted to say yes immediately. What if people don't come back? What if tonight was just novelty? He smiled. "You don't understand. This restaurant has been successful, yes, but we've been looking for something that makes us special, that makes us stand out. You're that something. People will come here specifically to hear you play." "I'm absolutely certain of it." She looked around the dining room, at the piano that had seemed so far out of reach just hours ago, at the space that had witnessed her humiliation and her triumph in the same evening. "I have one condition," she said. He raised his eyebrows. "Name it." "I want to keep washing dishes 1 day a week." He looked confused. "Why would you want to do that?" "Because I never want to forget where I came from. I never want to forget what it feels like to be underestimated, to be invisible. And I never want to treat anyone the way I was treated tonight." He studied her face for a long moment. Then he smiled. "You're quite something." "You know that?" "I'm just someone who got a second chance," she said. "And I'm not going to waste it." They shook hands on the deal. As his hand clasped hers, she felt the 3 years of hiding and surviving and just getting by crack open. Underneath was the person she used to be. The person she could be again, but better this time. Stronger. Because she'd been broken and had survived. Because she'd scrubbed pots and endured mockery and kept going anyway. Because she knew now that your worth isn't determined by your job title, or where you came from, or how people treat you. Your worth is something you carry inside. And tonight she'd finally remembered hers. The first week after that night felt like living in someone else's life. She woke up in her small apartment every morning, half convinced it had all been a dream. That she'd go to the restaurant and find herself back at the dish station, the manager smirking at her. Everything back to the way it was. But it wasn't a dream. The restaurant owner, true to his word, had her sign a proper contract by Monday. He introduced her to the staff not as the dishwasher, but as their new house pianist. Some of the servers who had watched her perform looked at her with new respect. Others seemed uncomfortable, like they weren't sure how to talk to her now that she wasn't at the bottom of the hierarchy. The piano was moved to a slightly raised platform near the windows. Nothing fancy, just 6 inches higher, but it made a difference. She was visible now, meant to be seen and heard. Her first official performance was that Friday. She spent the week practicing, trying to shake off the rust of 3 years. Her apartment neighbors probably hated her. She didn't own a piano, so she stayed late at the restaurant every night using their Steinway to prepare. Her fingers remembered more than she expected. Some pieces came back perfectly. Others needed work. The line cooks would peek out from the kitchen to listen. The older dishwasher, the one who had hugged her, would sit at a table during her breaks and just smile. Even the bartender, a gruff man who rarely spoke, told her once that she made the place feel classier. But she kept her promise to herself. Every Tuesday morning she came in and washed dishes for 4 hours. The owner had tried to talk her out of it. "You don't need to do this," he said. "You've proven whatever point you needed to prove." "It's not about proving a point," she explained. "It's about remembering, about staying grounded." So every Tuesday, she tied on an apron and scrubbed pots alongside her former co-workers. They treated her the same as always, which was exactly what she wanted. The older woman still shared her lunch. The young prep cook still told terrible jokes. It felt normal in a way nothing else did. That first Friday performance drew a decent crowd. Word had spread a little. Some of the donors from the charity event came back, bringing friends. The local paper had run a small story about the dishwasher, who turned out to be a concert pianist. It was buried on page 6, but it was something. She played Chopin and Debussy again, threw in some lighter pieces, a bit of Gershwin, some gentle jazz. She watched people's faces while she played, learning to read what they enjoyed. When couples leaned closer together, she knew she'd hit the right mood. When conversations stopped and people just listened, she knew she had them. After that performance, the restaurant owner pulled her aside. He was grinning ear to ear. "Reservations for next Friday are already up 30%. People are specifically asking what time you play. This is working." And it did work. Week by week, more people came. The restaurant started advertising her performances. Not with her name at first, just live piano music Friday through Sunday evenings. But people talked. Reviews mentioned the exceptional pianist. Food bloggers came for the dinner and stayed for the music. Her life began to change in small ways. She could afford to buy real groceries instead of the cheapest options. She got her hair cut at an actual salon instead of doing it herself in her bathroom mirror. She bought new clothes. Nothing fancy, but clothes without stains or worn patches. The business cards from that first night sat on her tiny kitchen table. She looked at them every day. The music professor, the Arts Foundation director, the couple who sponsored artists. She wanted to call them, wanted to reach out and grab at the possibilities they represented, but fear held her back. What if they'd forgotten about her? What if they'd made those offers in the moment, but didn't really mean them? What if she was meant to stay small, stay safe, stay in this one restaurant for the rest of her life? 3 weeks after her first performance, a man in his 40s came to the restaurant alone. He sat at a table near the piano and ordered a modest dinner. While she played, he watched her intently, not in a creepy way, in the focused way of someone studying something important. When she took a break, he approached her. "Excuse me, I hope I'm not bothering you. I'm a journalist with the city newspaper. I'd love to talk to you about your story. The transition from concert pianist to dishwasher to house performer. I think readers would find it fascinating." Her stomach clenched. The last time she'd trusted a journalist, it had destroyed her career. He seemed to sense her hesitation. "I know you might have reasons to be cautious about press. I did some research. I found articles about you from Europe, about what happened." His expression was kind. "I'm not interested in sensationalism. I want to tell your story properly, with your permission and approval." She thought about it for a long moment. "Can I see the article before it publishes? Can I approve the final version?" "Absolutely. You'll have complete control over what appears." They met for coffee the next day. She told him everything. About her childhood, about her rise in the classical music world, about the interview that ended it all, about arriving in this country with nothing, about 3 years of invisible work, about the manager's mockery and the unexpected chance to play again. He took notes carefully, asking thoughtful questions. "What you're describing is a very American story in a way," he said. "Starting over, getting a second chance, being underestimated and proving everyone wrong." "I suppose it is," she said, "though I never felt very American." "I still don't, really. I feel like someone between worlds. Not quite belonging to my old life anymore, but not fully settled in a new one either. Maybe that's the most American thing of all, he said with a smile. The article ran 2 weeks later on the front page of the arts section. He'd kept his promise. She'd reviewed every word, changed a few things, approved the rest. The headline read, "From concert halls to kitchen sinks, a pianist's unlikely journey." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The restaurant's phone rang constantly with people making reservations. The owner had to start turning people away. They moved her performances to 5 nights a week instead of 3. She played 2 sets each night and people stayed for both. But more than that, opportunities started appearing. The music professor called. "I'd like you to come speak to my students at the university. About perseverance. About keeping your art alive even when circumstances are against you. There's an honorarium, of course," the Arts Foundation director called. "We have a concert series starting next month. Small venue, about 200 seats. We'd love to have you perform a full recital, your choice of program." The couple who sponsored artists invited her to lunch at an expensive restaurant. Over pasta and wine, they explained their foundation. "We help artists who have faced setbacks. We provide grants, connect people with opportunities, sometimes just help with practical things like getting a decent instrument. We'd like to add you to our roster if you're interested." Standing in her apartment after that lunch, looking at the business card they'd given her, she felt something unfamiliar. It took her a moment to recognize what it was. Hope. Real, tangible hope for a future beyond just surviving. But the most unexpected call came from across the ocean. "Hello, is this the pianist from the article?" The voice was accented, formal. "My name is Pavel Moravec. I am a concert promoter based in Vienna. I represent several venues across Europe. I read about your story and I have a proposition for you." Her heart stopped. Vienna, where she'd performed some of her greatest concerts, where she'd felt most alive on stage. "I'm listening," she managed to say. "The article mentioned you were blacklisted in your home country, but that blacklist doesn't extend to all of Europe. Many countries would welcome you. I've been speaking with colleagues. There's interest in your story, yes, but more importantly, there's interest in your playing. I found some old recordings online. You are exceptional." He paused and she could hear papers rustling. "I would like to arrange a tour. 6 cities over 3 weeks. Small venues at first. Places that appreciate artistry over politics. If it goes well, we could expand. Bring you back to where you belong." She sat down hard on her second-hand couch. "I don't understand. Why would you do this? You don't even know me." "I knew someone once," he said quietly. "Another musician who ran afoul of an authoritarian government. He never got his second chance. He died in obscurity, bitter and broken. When I read your story, I thought perhaps I could help someone else have a different ending." They talked for an hour, about logistics, timing, repertoire, about the challenges and the possibilities. By the end of the call, she had preliminary dates for a European tour 6 months away, 6 months to prepare, to practice, to become who she used to be. After she hung up, she sat in her apartment in silence. Sunlight streamed through her one window. She could hear her neighbors through the thin walls. Smell cooking from other apartments. This small space had been her whole world for 3 years. Now that world was expanding, opening up, becoming something she'd thought was lost forever. She thought about the manager who had laughed at her. About the moment she'd decided to say, "I can play," instead of staying silent. How one moment of courage had changed everything. But she also thought about the Tuesday mornings washing dishes, about the older woman who shared her lunch, about the line cooks who peeked out to hear her practice, about staying connected to struggle even when things got better. She picked up her phone and called the restaurant owner. "I need to talk to you about the European tour," she said. "I want to do it, but I also want to come back. I want this restaurant to still be my home base. Can we make that work?" She could hear the smile in his voice. "Of course we can. This place will always have a piano waiting for you. You're family now, family." She hadn't felt like she belonged to anything for so long. Now she had this restaurant, these people, this new life she was building. But there was one more call she needed to make. She pulled out the card from the Arts Foundation director. The concert series, the 200-seat venue, her choice of program. When the director answered, she didn't hesitate. "I'd like to do the concert," she said. And I have an idea for the program. I want to play pieces by composers who faced oppression, whose work was banned or censored, who created beauty despite living under regimes that tried to silence them. I want to tell their stories through music. There was a pause. Then the director's excited voice. That's brilliant. That's exactly the kind of programming we love. Let's make it happen. As she hung up, she walked to her window and looked out at the city, this place that had seemed so foreign and overwhelming when she first arrived. This place where she'd hidden and survived and eventually found herself again. Tomorrow she'd go to the restaurant and play. In 6 months she'd tour Europe. In between, she'd wash dishes every Tuesday and remember where she came from. But tonight she just stood at her window and felt grateful. For second chances, for unexpected moments that change everything, for the courage to say I can play when everyone expected her to stay silent. She'd stolen the show that night weeks ago. But the truth was bigger than that. She hadn't stolen anything. She'd reclaimed what was always hers, her music, her voice, her life. 6 months passed like a strange dream. The restaurant became famous for its pianist. People came from other cities just to hear her play. Food critics mentioned her in their reviews alongside descriptions of the salmon and the wine list. She was part of the experience now, part of what made Riverside Restaurant special. The concert for the Arts Foundation was scheduled for a Thursday evening in April. She'd spent weeks preparing the program. Chopin, of course, but also Shostakovich, who had composed under Stalin's shadow. Prokofiev, who had navigated Soviet censorship. A piece by a modern composer from her homeland who'd been imprisoned for his art. The venue was called the Meridian Hall. It seated exactly 218 people. She'd visited it weeks before, walked the stage, tested the piano. A beautiful Steinway, older than the one at the restaurant but with a rich, warm sound. The day of the concert, she woke up with butterflies in her stomach. She hadn't performed a full solo recital in over 3 years. Yes, she'd been playing at the restaurant 5 nights a week, but that was background music. Pleasant accompaniment to dinner conversation. This was different. This was people paying to sit in silence and listen to nothing but her for 90 minutes. She spent the morning practicing in the empty restaurant. The owner had given her a key months ago so she could come whenever she wanted. Her fingers felt good, strong. The pieces were ready, but the fear was still there, lurking under the confidence. What if she froze? What if her hands shook so badly she couldn't play? What if everyone had come expecting the concert pianist from the newspaper article, and instead got the dishwasher having a panic attack? Around noon, her phone rang. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Hello? Is this the pianist? The voice was elderly, shaky with age. From the newspaper article? The one who plays at Riverside Restaurant? Yes, that's me. I'm sorry to bother you on the day of your concert. I read about it in the paper. I just wanted to tell you something before you go on stage tonight. She sat down, curious. Okay. My husband was a violinist. Years ago, before you were born probably. He was brilliant. Really brilliant. But he was terrified of performing. The nerves ate him alive. He'd be sick before every concert, shaking so hard he could barely hold his instrument. The woman paused and she heard a breath being drawn. One day an old musician told him something. She said, "The fear never goes away. It's not supposed to. It means you care. It means what you're doing matters. The trick isn't to get rid of the fear. It's to play anyway. To walk on stage with your heart pounding and your hands shaking and to play anyway." Tears pricked at her eyes. My husband played for 40 years after that. Never stopped being scared. But he played anyway, and it was beautiful. So tonight, when you're scared, and you will be scared, just remember, you're supposed to be scared. Play anyway. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. After the call ended, she sat in the empty restaurant for a long time. The afternoon light came through the windows, falling across the piano in golden stripes. She thought about that violinist she'd never met, about courage not being the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. At 4 o'clock, she went home to get ready. She'd bought a new dress for the concert. Nothing too fancy, but nice. Deep blue, elegant and simple. She did her makeup carefully, fixed her hair, looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Not the exhausted dishwasher with rough hands and tired eyes. Not exactly the young concert pianist from years ago either. Someone new, someone who carried both of those people inside her, and had become something more because of it. The university where she'd spoken to students had sent flowers to her apartment. The couple who sponsored artists had sent a card wishing her luck. The restaurant staff had signed a banner that said, "You've got this," in at least 7 different handwritings. She arrived at the Meridian Hall at 5:30 for a 6 o'clock sound check. The venue coordinator was a nervous young man who seemed more anxious than she was. "We've sold out completely," he told her. "Standing room only. We had to turn people away. That never happens for our classical series." The piano on stage was perfect. The acoustics were incredible. Every note hung in the air just right. She played a few scales, tested some passages from the evening's program. It felt good. Felt right. Backstage, she had 30 minutes alone. That's when the real fear hit. Her hands started shaking. Her breathing got shallow. She paced back and forth in the small dressing room, her heart racing. "You're supposed to be scared. Play anyway." She thought about the violinist, about her mother who had worked 3 jobs, about the older woman at the restaurant who still shared her lunch, about every person who had believed in her when she didn't believe in herself. She thought about the manager who had laughed at her and how wrong he'd been. At 7:58, the coordinator knocked on her door. 2 minutes. She walked to the wings of the stage. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see the audience filling every seat. People were standing along the back wall. She recognized faces from the restaurant. The music professor was in the 3rd row. The Arts Foundation director sat near the front. And there, in the very back, standing because all the seats were taken, was the entire restaurant staff. The owner, the bartender, the servers, the line cooks, the older dishwasher. They'd closed the restaurant for the night so everyone could come. Her heart felt like it might burst. The house lights dimmed. The audience grew quiet. The coordinator gestured to her. "You're on." She walked onto the stage. The applause was warm and welcoming. She sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, took a breath, then she began to play. The first piece was Chopin, the same nocturne she'd played that first night at the restaurant. But tonight it meant something different. Tonight it was the opening chapter of a longer story. She played it perfectly, every note where it needed to be, every emotion clear and true. The audience was absolutely silent except for the music. She moved through the program piece by piece. Shostakovich's dark, defiant passages that spoke of resistance. Prokofiev's complexity and beauty created under the shadow of censorship. Each composer had faced their own version of what she'd faced. Each had been told to be silent. Each had played anyway. Between pieces, she spoke briefly about each composer, told their stories, made the connection explicit. "This is what it sounds like to refuse to be silenced," she said before one piece. "This is what courage sounds like when it's translated into music." The audience understood. She could feel them with her, following the journey she was laying out in sound. The final piece was by the modern composer from her homeland. He'd been imprisoned for writing music that criticized the government. Had served 5 years before being released into exile. The piece was called Hope in Darkness, and it was the most technically challenging thing she'd ever learned. Her fingers flew across the keys. The music built and swelled, dark passages giving way to light, despair transforming into something that could almost be called joy. It was exhausting and exhilarating, and she played it with everything she had. The final chord rang out and faded into silence. For a moment, nothing. Just that perfect silence after music ends and before the world rushes back in. Then the audience erupted. Not just applause. A standing ovation. People cheering. She saw the line cooks whistling. The older dishwasher was crying openly. The music professor was on his feet, clapping so hard it looked like it hurt. She stood and bowed. The applause continued. She bowed again. Still it continued. They were clapping for the music, yes, but also for the journey, for the comeback, for the refusal to stay down, for the courage to walk onto a stage after losing everything and play anyway. She returned to the piano and played an encore. Something lighter this time, a Gershwin piece that made people smile. Then she bowed one final time and left the stage. Backstage, the coordinator was grinning. "That was incredible. People are already asking when you'll perform again." The next hour was a blur. People lined up to meet her, to thank her, to tell her their own stories of starting over, of second chances, of finding courage. The music,